All right, it just broadcasted, so now people can join. All right, we have attendees coming on. I am live on Facebook and we're recording. We're good to go.
Okay, I'm going to give us another 30 seconds to make sure we give folks just more of an opportunity to start with us at the start. So again, we'll be starting in less than a minute.
Cuatro, uno, cinco, cinco, siete, siete, seis, uno, nueve.
Oh, does someone have the slide that I was going to have posted when
I've got it set.
You can let me start talking a little bit before you put it up, or it doesn't really matter?
Yeah, I'll put it up right when John introduces you. How does that sound?
That sounds great.
All right, let's get started. Welcome, everyone. This is John Horning. I'm the Executive Director of Wild Earth Guardians. This is the latest edition of Wild Earth webinars. We have Guardian supporters from all over the country taking part in this webinar. Now, more than ever, we really are delighted to have the opportunity to connect with the Guardians community as we're all dealing with such turbulence and chaotic times due to the global pandemic and the police brutality and the social unrest that have resulted. And of course, from a president who is inciting more violence and social upheaval. We're all affected by these events in different ways. And so I hope opportunities like this to come together remind us all of our unifying humanity. These Wild Earth webinars are an opportunity for us to bring together local, regional, and national issue experts, people from impacted communities, elected officials, and Wild Earth Guardian staff to talk about a critical issue at a critical time. Our purpose is to inform and inspire and activate Guardians like all of you who are on the call to help us confront powerful industries, demand greater leadership from our elected officials, to really help solve the nature and climate crises and create the kind of world that we want. Today, we'll be talking about Mexican gray wolves and their recovery in the American Southwest. Mexican wolves are one of the most endangered mammals in the United States. They were on the brink of extinction before a very heroic effort was launched to capture the last 7 wolves in the wild and initiate a captive breeding program. After a series of lawsuits and relentless political and grassroots pressure, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service reintroduced wolves in 1998. Today, we have just 160 or so wolves that roam the wilds of the greater Gila. As we're convening, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is taking public comments on the very early stages of a new management plan that will guide where wolves live and under what conditions. With me today are Dave Parsons of Project Coyote and the Rewilding Institute, Kelly Nokes, staff attorney with the Western Environmental Law Center, and Chris Smith, Wild Earth Guardians Southern Rockies wildlife advocate. Welcome to each of you. It's good to have you.
Thank you.
Good to be here.
Thanks, John.
Yeah. So I wanted to start just by asking each of you to describe your role in the campaign to protect Mexican wolves and share a brief story about your experience with wolves. We can start with you, Kelly.
Sure. Well, like John said, my name is Kelly Nokes. I'm the Shared Earth Wildlife Attorney for the Western Environmental Law Center, and I am based in Taos, New Mexico. And the Western Environmental Law Center is a nonprofit public interest law firm that we use the power of the law to safeguard the public lands, the wildlife, and the communities of the American West in the face of a changing climate. And I'm a litigator, and so I provide an important voice for wolves in the courtroom to ensure that the government officials that are responsible for ensuring Mexican wolves are eventually restored and recovered to their native wild habitats across the Southwest are held accountable to our most fundamental environmental laws, including the Endangered Species Act and the National Environmental Policy Act. We're currently representing guardians and a number of other conservation organizations in federal district court to ensure that Mexican wolves are managed under a recovery plan that truly allows for the conservation and restoration of the species. And we also represented guardians and others in successful litigation challenging the service's prior management rule for the species. Our win back in that case in 2018 is what has now forced the service to go back to the drawing board to promulgate a new Section 10J rule that complies with the mandates of the Endangered Species Act. And I guess just one story about wolves. I remember the first time that I heard a wolf. I was camping just west of, I think it's called Mangus Mountain in the Gila National Forest. It was definitely a stormy summer night, and we had rushed in the storm to set up our tent and made soup in the tent in a downpour of rain. But as the storm passed by, we were able to get outside, and the sky cleared up and the stars were so bright. And we were just sitting there quietly taking in the stars and that crisp, after the rainfall air. And that's where I heard my first howl of a wild Mexican wolf. It was a pretty amazing experience. It's a very magical sound to hear up close. And I only wish I could hear that sound again someday up here in the prime suitable habitats of the southern Sangre de Cristo Mountains where I live. So hopefully someday. That's what we're working towards.
Thanks, Kelly. That's a beautiful story. Appreciate you sharing that. Dave?
Thank you, John. I currently serve as the science advisor for Project Coyote, and I'm the carnivore conservation biologist for the Rewilding Institute. I had a career with the Fish and Wildlife Service of 24 years. I retired from them 20 years ago, and for the last 20 years, I've been advocating for the Mexican wolf. I've commented on every action that the Fish and Wildlife Service has proposed. Joined lawsuits as a plaintiff and declarant, and stayed active in trying to help save the Mexican wolf. My story starts 30 years ago when I was in a relatively boring job in the Fish and Wildlife Service in Albuquerque. And one night I came home from work, and at the dinner table I was opening the mail, and there was a postcard there from the Wolf Action Group, and they were soliciting funds to finance a lawsuit to sue the Fish and Wildlife Service to implement the 1982 recovery plan. This was in the spring of 1990. They were asking for money. I looked at my wife across the table. I said, honey, I'm going to send them $100 because I think I want that job. 6 months later, I was in that job in October of 1990. And fast forward 8 years to this picture, and we're moving the first wolves into the release bins. And on Super Bowl Sunday, January 25th, 1998, in the Apache National Forest in eastern Arizona. And of significance are the people on the corners of that crate with the orange on his jacket there. Of course, most people will recognize Secretary of Interior Bruce Babbitt, who was a real champion for wolves. He made a legacy, really, in his two terms as Secretary of Interior for wolf recovery, both in Yellowstone National Park and in the Southwest. The other corner on the front is Jamie Clark, who was then the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and now, of course, the director of Defenders of Wildlife. And of particular significance, the lady on the back corner behind Secretary Babbitt is a granddaughter of Aldo Leopold. It's also the daughter of Lena Leopold. And of course, Leopold has, has a legacy with the wolf, and was a proponent early on for restoring wolves, especially the Yellowstone National Park. And that's kind of a younger version of me over there on the left, guiding them all to the pen. And there's two important issues I want to just mention briefly here that are depicted here. One is the power of the citizen suit provision of the Endangered Species Act in Section 11, which Kelly works with every day. It allows anybody to sue the Fish and Wildlife Service if they're not getting the job done on recovering endangered species. And the other is the opportunity that's presented when the right people are in the right positions of authority or political windows of opportunity. And we had President Clinton from 1993 through the year 2000, which were the years of wolf recovery. And we had Bruce Babbitt, fortunately, in the position of the Secretary of the Interior, who championed those programs. So when we get those political windows of opportunity, we have to ride them. Right now, we have a legal window of opportunity that we're about to ride out, and we'll talk more about that later. Thank you.
It's great to have you, Dave. Great to share that history. Didn't know that it was Super Bowl Sunday when you were out bringing the wolves first back to the greater Gila. Chris, how about you?
I am the Southern Rockies wildlife advocate for Wild Earth Guardians. And that to me means a lot of things, but primarily what it means very broadly is that I work to bring mostly the public and public sentiment and public values to bear in moving wildlife policy in the desert Southwest, my home region, into the 21st century. And so that means scientific wildlife policy, ethical wildlife policy, and then lower D, democratic wildlife policy, such that Americans and folks in the Southwest have a say at the table, have a seat so that they can express their values and move our wildlife policy in the United States, which is, very much lagging. Some would say it's 20th century policy, some would say it's 19th century policy. Move that into the 21st century so that our wildlife, our wild places, our landscapes, our ecologies have a chance facing a climate crisis, facing drought, so that they're fostered with resilience provided by biodiversity. And for the Mexican wolf and recovery efforts around Lobos, my main job is to communicate about Lobos, to educate people about Lobos, to organize people around Lobos, and move people to build a base of supporters and defenders and guardians of Mexican wolves as they go through this tumultuous recovery process. And I have never heard or seen a Mexican wolf. I have heard and seen northern gray wolves. But despite not having seen or heard one, I have spent some magical nights down in the Gila wilderness. And those were made magical in large part by the presence of Mexican wolves, because even though I haven't seen them, the hope of hearing or seeing those wolves creates kind of a tangible wildness. Their presence is out there, you can feel it, and it makes the night that much more special. So that's my Mexican wolf story as of now, and I hope to add some more substance and detail to it, maybe even later this summer.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. It's a great group that we have here for this conversation. And again, thankful for each of you for sharing your stories. I thought since each of you were bringing your wolf spirit into the room, that spirit would call forth the wolves. So it felt like an opportune time to hear from from our primary interest for this convening. So the howl of a wolf is obviously a magical thing. Why, just from each of you for a moment, why does wolf recovery matter? Whether it's, from your own personal and professional perspective, why does it matter? Dave.
Thank you, John. Well, it has a special significance to me, of course, because I was there at the beginning, but it matters not so much, but actually it does matter for us as much as it matters for the wolf, that we have intact ecosystems that are functioning as they should. And the wolves have been shown now with all the fabulous research, especially coming out of Yellowstone National Park, that they have very significant control over the structure and the function of the ecosystem and the biological diversity of the ecosystem. And I would point to a brand new paper just out in the journal PNAS by some really high-powered 3 biologists. And it has to do with I think I have the title here, Vertebrates on the Brink as Indicators of Biological Annihilation and the 6th Mass Extinction. And there's a lot of literature coming out now about the 6th Mass Extinction and the loss of not only individuals, species to extinction itself, but the loss of significant populations of those species over space and time that has tremendous effect on ecosystem services. And there's a lot more coming out on how preserving ecosystem services is absolutely critical to preserving ourselves as human beings on the planet.
Chris, Kelly, additional thoughts about why this matters?
Sure. I mean, I echo everything that Dave said, of course. I mean, I'm into wildlife conservation in large part for, as I mentioned, resilient ecosystems and biodiversity to carry our world as long as we can. But I also think that the lobo in particular is importantly symbolic, because as you mentioned, John, these animals were all but eradicated by a kind of a symphony of state-sponsored and private hunters and trappers. And if we as a society can atone for that particular sin by rewilding the landscape with this very iconic, very unique carnivore, I think that provides a sign of hope and responsibility and capacity that we can do better by the rest of wildlife and by the rest of our environment. And so while lobos certainly play a key ecological role, I think they play a key narrative role too, as we try to heal and restore and protect landscapes that have been frankly abused, especially over the last couple of centuries.
Kelly, any additional thoughts?
Well, I totally agree with Dave's scientific perspective and Chris bringing in the moral reasons, but looking at it from the legal perspective, Congress has made endangered species recovery a priority and a mandate that we as a nation must strive to achieve. I mean, the ultimate goal of the ESA is to provide a means whereby the ecosystems upon which endangered and threatened species and we ourselves depend may be conserved, meaning that, the protections of the act are no longer necessary. And I think it's our duty to ensure that those responsible for ensuring Mexican wolves are eventually restored to their native landscapes are held accountable. And sometimes we need to use the power of the law to assist them in figuring out what that means to truly recover a species in accordance with the law as Congress intended. And I would just also ultimately, agree that, we need to restore the wolf to restore the balance that nature has always intended.
It's great. We did not coordinate this. I love to hear the scientific, moral, ethical, and legal bases for restoring wolves. I'm interested to hear from each of you again how you think Mexican wolf recovery is going, and I'll share this. I feel like for me this year has been more of the swings of excitement and despair in wolf recovery, from bad news about trapping and good news about wolf population numbers and bad news about animal damage control killing them. And I feel like my emotions have vacillated between exuberance and excitement. And I'm curious to hear from each of you, again, maybe starting with Dave, about, given your tenure, how do you think it's going?
Well, I guess the answer is mixed and not as well as it could have and should be. We've got numbers coming up, and everybody looks to that as a positive sign that things are getting better for Mexican wolves. They increased by 24% last year, and we have 163 wolves on the ground. But numbers are can be deceiving because the genetic condition of the wild population is, quite frankly, dismal. There are several measures of genetic health that genetic scientists use, and by every one of those measures, the trajectories are in the wrong direction. We're losing gene diversity. The average relatedness of Mexican wolves in the wild today are the same as the relatedness of brothers and sisters on average. That's a lot of inbreeding. It's going to come home to get us one of these days. The agency is in denial that that's a problem. And so their efforts to fix that are less than they should be in terms of getting genetically diverse animals out of the captive population into the wild. But the good news is we have a chance to educate them now with this court order that's causing the rules to be revised. So that's some of my perspective. We still got wolves. We're getting more of them, but there are some serious problems looming on the horizon.
Kelly, what about you? Good news, bad news? What do you see in where we are in wolf recovery?
Well, I mean, I agree with both of you. I mean, it's encouraging to see the recent successes of the gains in the wild population by all means, but it still comes down to, now we just really need to allow the wolves to be restored throughout their wild habitat. And there are still just a number of obstacles that seem to be in their way. I mean, for example, you have the current management rule, which hopefully we can fix this, but there's a population cap at only a fraction of what's needed for recovery. And it prohibits the wolves in the wild from actually naturally dispersing to their viable, suitable habitats in, say, the ecologically rich Southern Rockies and Grand Canyon ecoregions. And the recovery program seems so focused on ensuring that the desires of domestic livestock producers that are utilizing our public lands take precedence over the needs of this critically imperiled species at times. And there's also, that social disconnect and the slew of myths and misinformation showcasing wolves as these dangerous and harmful animals instead of the science and the facts being at the forefront, which show the key role that these apex predators play in the health of the ecosystems that they inhabit. So we have a lot of obstacles to overcome, which I think we can do. I hope we can do. We'll work towards it.
What about you, Chris? Dave mentioned the genetic problems. Kelly talked about livestock industry as a big obstacle. What else would you add to how it's going and what the obstacles are?
In my brief time working on wolf recovery, I have a fairly cynical take on it, frankly. I've seen recovery largely spurred by lawsuits from groups like Wild Earth Guardians and other conservationists, and really handicapped or hobbled by federal agencies. Yes, we haven't seen a very proactive U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Dave mentioned taking on the looming genetic crisis, which they seem reticent to do, but also state agencies. Arizona and New Mexico have, and Utah and Colorado, even though wolves aren't that far north yet, they've played a very active role in trying to hobble this recovery. And that's disheartening to see, no doubt, and that enables and emphasizes some of the other obstacles that both Kelly and Dave pointed out. But where I see hope is in changing the attitudes of leadership and wildlife agencies in those two states, primarily New Mexico and Arizona, but also we're seeing some proactivity in Colorado, such that those states will, I'm hoping, in the next few years become, catalysts for U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, prompting them to do right by the Lobo rather than fighting them tooth and nail whenever U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually wants to take proactive steps. So I've seen a lot to make me cynical, but there's some hopeful signs on the horizon, I think.
So you talk about the state wildlife agencies and them not doing enough. Of course, all the state wildlife agencies are flawed in one form or another. I'm curious if maybe you could take this question again, Dave, first. Wolf recovery in the Northern Rockies, controversial as it is, started 2 years, or maybe it was 3 years, prior to wolf recovery in the Southwest. And wolf recovery in the Northern Rockies, though, again, very controversial, highly politicized, the trajectory in terms of numbers of wolves is vastly different than what has happened in the Southwest. Why has the recovery process been so painstakingly slow in the Southwest relative to the Northern Rockies?
Two pretty good reasons in my mind. One is we don't have a Yellowstone National Park equivalent. We don't have 4 million acres where hunting and cows are excluded, which had 3 times as many elk as it should have had when we put wolves into Yellowstone National Park. I mean, they just exploded in there because they had good habitat. They had more food than they could possibly eat. And so they have thrived. And what that gives you is a source population to feed wolves out into the adjacent public lands, which have really all the issues we have, except we have them everywhere with the politics of cows, with a minor exception of maybe 400,000 or 500,000 acres at the most in the middle of the Gila region that cow-free at the moment. So, and that's not enough to support a wolf population. So we're dealing with those politics everywhere down here. And the states put tremendous pressure on the federal government to, quite frankly, not do the right thing for wolves, to keep them down. That's why we have a population cap of 325, because the states demanded that and the Fish and Wildlife Service conceded. That's why wolves don't get to go north of Interstate 40 for the same reason. Now I could go into a lot more detail, but we had one really good recovery team that was formed in 2010 that had independent scientists. They recommended that we needed 750 wolves in 3 different populations in the Southwest United States. And 2 of those were north of Interstate 40. And when that draft recovery plan came out, the states went ballistic. They jumped all over the federal agencies. The Fish and Wildlife Service disbanded the recovery team, and they started over again and developed a new plan by listening to the states and not to the independent scientists. And that's what we get. We get a plan that's not going to get us to wolf recovery. It's being sued, by the way. So there we have Section 11 again coming into play with citizen lawsuits, because they just continue to do the wrong thing unless they're sued to do the right thing.
Yeah. Politics everywhere, big obstacle, the politics of the state agencies, the absence of a Yellowstone. Other thoughts about why the process, or amplification on Dave's thoughts, either you, Kelly, or Chris, about why it's been so slow here in the Southwest?
Yeah, I think Dave hit it on the head. I think that for Mexican wolves, this subspecies of gray wolf, it's such an incredibly critically imperiled species. I mean, they were derived from only 7 founding wolves when the very last Mexican wolves known to exist in the wild were captured and placed into a captive breeding program to keep them from going extinct. And I think it's important, while it's termed reintroduction, we must always remember that Mexican wolves were always a natural part of the Southwest ecosystem. And without their howls, a key prong of the balance of this ecosystem remains missing. And I think Dave was exactly right without the large loss of national park lands to work with in the Southwest, the reintroduction efforts need to be much more carefully balanced with the private land uses that have taken over the Mexican wolves' native habitat since they were eradicated from the wild. And so I think it's the combination, both the severe, dire status of the subspecies and the social dynamics that are at play down here that make Mexican wolf recovery in the Southwest much more difficult than the recovery efforts for their brethren up to the north.
Chris,
Yeah.
anything to
I
add
would
to that? Yeah.
add, that Yellowstone National Park creates this big protected area, but I don't think we can really overemphasize the tourism that drives in Yellowstone and other areas up north. If anyone has been down to the Gila trying to find wolves and also been up to Yellowstone National Park trying to find wolves, you'll see a drastic difference in kind of the commodification of that venture of going to hear wolves, to see wolves. And, New Mexico is making a lot of noise about boosting its outdoor recreation economy, diversifying our economy more broadly. And wolves could play a really big part in that if there's encouragement, if there's infrastructure, and that in turn changes some of the social and economic dynamics that Kelly was alluding to down in the southwestern part of the state. So that's just one other aspect I think that can't be glossed over.
Yep. Interesting. I'd like to shift the conversation a little bit to what each of you, I think, has alluded to, which is the current planning effort that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is engaged in. And I want to remind all of our participants that the Fish and Wildlife Service is allowing for, as they are required to do by law, public comment at the very beginning of the process of what we are saying is hopefully getting wolf recovery right. That comment period closes in 5 days, June 15th. And so I hope that if you haven't already, that you will take action for the Lobo once this webinar ends today. As we know, when our voices are heard, whether it's on the streets or at the ballot box or in these comment processes, it can make a difference. So please, let's flood their inbox and have an overwhelming amount of support for full-fledged Lobo recovery. I'm wondering if you, Kelly, maybe could start by describing the process that the Fish and Wildlife Service is engaged in, and then even others, its significance to wolf recovery. Again, we're talking about around all of this, but I want to focus the next 10 to 15 minutes on the planning effort. So Kelly, why don't you kick us off and how it came about and why it's significant?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just as some the background, Mexican wolves are managed as an experimental population under Section 10 of the Endangered Species Act. And Section 10 allows for species to be reintroduced into the wild in order to further the species' chances for eventual recovery. And experimental populations are managed under these very special management rules called a Section 10J rule, as you've heard us alluding to. And that's the subject of the service's current rulemaking process. And in short, this rule is a blueprint basically detailing all the aspects of how the service plans to manage the species, from the beginning of how to restore them to the wild by releases and reintroductions, and then once they're on the ground, how to manage them. So this rule will contain management provisions for things like how many wolves will be allowed, when the service can remove them from the wild, and where the wolves will be permitted to roam. And so it's really a critically important piece of the law that details how, when, and where the service will carry out its duty under the Endangered Species Act to restore this critically imperiled species in the wild. And I mean, just I guess for some background, this rulemaking derives from one of the lawsuits that I alluded to earlier. We challenged the current rule that's in effect right now, the 2015 10J rule, for its failure to conserve the species and its failure to ensure that the Mexican wolf's eventual recovery in the wild will be achieved. And the court, the federal district court in Arizona in March of 2018 agreed with us. They agreed with us that the arbitrary population cap that allows for only 300 to 325 Mexican wolves in the wild was arbitrary and capricious. They agreed with us that the purely politically based boundary stopping wolves from venturing north of I-40 was arbitrary and capricious. And they also said that, the service's failure to consider whether the population should be managed as an essential population or a non-essential experimental population under Section 10J was also contrary to the ESA. And the essential, non-essential piece is a pretty important piece. That was a big win for us, I think, that forced the service to actually go back to the drawing board and get rid of their default assumption. An essential species in the wild actually is defined as a species in which the experimental population's loss would be likely to appreciably reduce the likelihood of the survival of the species in the wild. And so if you think about Mexican wolves in particular, there's really only the experimental population. We captured all of the wild wolves and put them into a captive breeding program. And so the ones that are in the wild right now are the sole population of Mexican wolves in the wild. And so just a plain reading of the statute and the law shows that this species, this experimental population, should be deemed as an essential population. And the importance of that essential designation is basically that they get these added protections. If this species is designated as essential, as we think it should be, the federal agencies like the Forest Service, who issues livestock raising permits, will be forced to consult with the Fish and Wildlife Service and assess the impacts of their actions on the species recovery. There's also the opportunity for the Fish and Wildlife Service to designate protected critical habitat under the law that would really give this species a chance at survival. So this rule is a really critical point for the species and its future recovery. And just in the fact that the 10-day management rule is it's a legally binding, it's codified in law, and the service, it outlines the plans that the service has for actually recovering the species under the ESA.
Thank you, Kelly. You talked a lot about the critical importance of the essential, non-essential designation. I hadn't thought about this, but Dave, you got the job you wanted in October of 1990 when you got that letter. You were there on the ground floor when I'm sure these issues were being talked about. What's I'm not asking you to defend it, but I think it'd be interesting for listeners to hear this. What's the agency's rationale if they were to defend the why of the non-essential designation?
In short, the rationale is that by using the non-essential classification, you make life easiest on yourself as an agency to do the things that especially your political interest groups are asking you to do.
But behind that, I'm curious, sorry for interrupting, but behind that, is there a belief that social tolerance, social acceptance goes up? Because, you could also make an argument that you're not making your job easier, you're just making it more difficult for everyone involved. But again, thoughts more.
Yeah, you hit a good point, and that has a lot to do with it. The concept of social tolerance. It's been used forever to justify doing things like removing wolves for killing livestock far in excess of what we probably should be doing. But there's research on that now that shows that liberalizing the taking of wolves does not improve social tolerance. In fact, it actually goes the other way. You get more poaching taking place when you liberalize the killing of wolves legally. It goes up illegally too. So everybody thought it would be the reverse, but there's no science that shows that yet. But the other thing is that they've never used essential. They've always gone non-essential. When I was running the program, I essentially got no choice in that matter because Yellowstone had led the way in how to do this, and they went non-essential. The red wolves had gone under non-essential experimental. It was just the model that was in place, and you could meet that standard of when you don't have any wolves in the wild, that if you're going to put out 11 to start with, that if you lose those, which in fact we did, they could be replaced. And so, you know, that was what we went on, but we put language in our 1998 rule that said that logic's not going to last forever because situation's going to get more dire for wolves. You can't leave them in captivity forever. If changes take place, they lose genetic diversity. They adapt to a different environment. So we actually inserted language saying that this classification was okay for then, but it would not be okay forever. And but the services just kept it forever.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and if I could just chime in, I think Dave's really right with that captivity piece. I mean, when I look at the 1998 10J rule and try to suss out how did they come up with this non-essential classification, it really seems to rely on the fact that we have wolves in captivity, that we can replace the wolves in the wild. But that totally undermines the congressional intent of the Endangered Species Act. I mean, the Endangered Species Act is intended to recover species in the wild, not in zoos. I mean, we're not going to be happy with just having a whole captive population and say that's recovery. So there's that piece. But then I also think that, you know, it comes to the question of what is recovery? I mean, are we always going to have this constant human intervention to support a recovered population? I don't feel like we can rely on wolves being in captivity alone as sufficient justification for saying that we've recovered the species. I mean, and the second point of that is that they're also reading language out of the statute. They're reading the in the wild language out of the statute by saying, well, we have wolves in captivity, so that's enough. And that's where we really need to hold them accountable to the statute, and the regulation says that they need to recover this species in the wild. And that's where we really need to make sure that we don't fall back on being okay with even our national parks serving as proverbial zoos. Like, oh, we can have grizzly bears in Yellowstone National Park and now we're done. That's not what recovery is under the Endangered Species Act. At least that's what we're arguing for. We feel the law is stronger than just settling for recovery of species at the most minimal populations we can and in the most minimal places we can, where we're okay with them surviving and allowing them to be.
So we've talked a lot about the importance of an essential designation. I've seen some questions here in the chat box where our participants want sort of wording. Thank you, Chris, for sending the link to our site to provide people that. But I'd really like to give people sort of the clear top line. We've touched on them, but the essential designation. What do we want to be? What's our message to the agency? Chris, if you could talk about, like, what are the top 3 or 4 things we want participants to underscore to them so that they're communicating what the priorities are to the Fish and Wildlife Service at this critical time?
Sure. Well, you know, I think the essentiality issue is really, really key. And I do have some additional thoughts on that, but because I've dwelled on that for a while, I would just encourage people when they're writing their comments to emphasize that and put that at the top of their minds and the top of their comments. A couple other, I think, key factors in this rulemaking process that we can attain will help to solve the genetic crisis, or try to solve the looming genetic crisis, and that is requesting that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service release adult wolves. So currently, Fish and Wildlife Service releases wolf pups into dens from captive breeding facilities. And they do that as a way to put more wolves into the wild population and supposedly increase the genetic health. But the likelihood of those wolves surviving, making it to breeding age, and then being allowed to breed and actually inject their genetic material into the wild population is pretty slim. And we don't have a good way to ensure that that's actually happening when we do these pup releases. Whereas if we released adult wolves in pairs with pups, we're basically directly injecting that genetic material into the wild population. So again, essentiality is the first one, releasing adult wolves is the second. And then if I had to choose a third, I would say we need a really high bar for wolf removals. Already this year, Fish and Wildlife Service has released removed 5 wolves from the wild. 4 of them were lethal removals intentionally, and the other one ended up being lethal after the wolf was taken into captivity. And currently the onus is on wolves to not do what they're naturally going to do, which is prey on wildlife and prey on cattle, which are the slowest, dumbest, tastiest morsels of food on the landscape. And that burden should be shifted so that ranchers and livestock growers have to take precautionary measures, be proactive in protecting their livestock on public lands from wolves. Because currently, wolves are removed basically at the tip of a hat when a rancher has a problem. And that paradigm needs to be shifted. Those are just a few quick things. I'm sure Kelly and Dave probably have a couple more.
Yeah, and just as a way of bringing Kelly and Dave back into the conversation, I have a specific couple questions. Can a rule like this prevent trapping? Can a rule like this require federal animal damage control agents to operate differently? And can a rule like this require public lands ranchers to engage in better animal husbandry practices? And answer your own question about what you think is important as you maybe answer those questions as well.
Well, let Kelly start on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, this rule definitely could prohibit all of those things. I mean, it definitely could prevent trapping, and it could limit the amount of take and removals that are allowed. Everything that's outlined, this is a special management rule specific to the experimental population. So there's very much the management flexibility to prohibit trapping in the Mexican wolf experimental population area. There's very much the ability to prohibit the take of the removal of wolves if livestock producers did not at first, implement coexistence practices. But that's something that we need to ask the service to do in this rule. That's definitely something where they've gone the opposite way. The current 2015 10J rule that we were successful in overturning, has provisions that allow for the take if domestic livestock is taken, and has provisions that allow for this unintended take for a trapper who, as long as they're following state laws and best practices, and they take a Mexican wolf, that's okay under this rule. And we're arguing that those provisions for take should, at the outright, be eliminated in the revised rule. I mean, the service should really look at the fact that they have a duty they can allow for levels of take, but they need to make sure that such take provisions don't work to the disadvantage of the species, and that in some way it's actually going to promote the recovery effort overall. And I would say arguably right now, the excessive levels of take that are allowed in the 2015 10J rule are far too excessive, and they work to the disadvantage of the species, and they don't promote the recovery effort overall. And that's something that the court faulted them on. So that's something that is back on the drawing board. So I think Chris is definitely right that that's one of the top 3 is let's eliminate the excessive levels of take in the revised 10J rule. And the only other 2 points that I say are the big talking points for me are we need to remove that population cap of 300 to 325 wolves. The service has a duty to follow the best available science, and that shows that they need a meta population of 750 wolves and 3 subpopulations of at least 200 each, and that ties into the boundary. They need to eliminate that boundary of I-40, which is purely politically based, and they need to allow for wolf recovery in the Southern Rockies and the Grand Canyon ecosystem. So
we got a lot of work to do.
Add to that briefly, John.
Yeah.
Kelly's right on all those points. She brought up something I wanted to get back into the conversation, that's use of best science. And we got something from this judge that you hardly ever see when you win a court case. Usually when agencies have their own scientists on staff, a court will not question the integrity of their science. But this one did. This judge looked at the science and said, you got it wrong. Your science, you're not using best science. And we rarely get that. So we have the extra hammer here of forcing the Fish and Wildlife Service to actually apply best science. And when you apply that, it applies to everything. The essentiality determination it has to be based on the best science. You can't just make a political choice there. It has to be justified. All these other provisions, the population cap was not initially based on science. And if they base it on science, they wouldn't have it, or they would at least triple it. The same with the boundaries, were admittedly political in the 2017 recovery planning process. They said they stopped things at I-70 for geopolitical reasons. So they're so blatantly open about the fact that none of these provisions are really founded in science, and they have to be by law. So that's a big push we need to make. I've done that in the comments that I've developed.
You know, it's interesting because I, of course, agree, like recovery programs, endangered species issues need to be bounded by science and the law. And yet we all know that politics plays a role. It's why litigation is important in holding the agencies to the letter of the law. And I was going to ask just this more open-ended question about how can we shift the politics of wolf recovery to give the agencies the space they need? It's a big question, but I'm curious as we head into our final 10 minutes here, because we're going to pound on the law. We're going to do that. We've got great lawyers like Kelly and others who are going to continue to represent us in the courts. Thank goodness, especially under this kind of administration, but really all the time. How can we, each of you, curious to hear from each of you about this question of how to improve the political context for wolf recovery in the Southwest. Anyone who's inspired, jump in.
Vote. Be sure to vote. Vote your politics, however you think they should fly. I mentioned the political windows of opportunity, and we're in the dark days of windows of opportunity right now, and that needs to change. There's so much, I really feel for the agency scientists, because I was one for 24 years, and a lot of pressure comes down politically. Back in my days with the agency, we would have celebrated this court victory hugely for giving us the cover to do the right thing. But today, the politics are so bad in the agency, starting with the administration, who sets the tone, of course. That and the intimidation on agency scientists is so great that they're even afraid to capture this opportunity. They've been handed on a platter by a judge saying, you got to get it right. The science has got to be the best science. You can't have caps. You can't do this. They've already announced, when they announced this public comment period, that they're going to defy most of what the judge has asked for. They say they're going to keep the limit at I-40. They say they're not going to change the cap. They say it boldly right out front that they're going to defy the court order, which of course gives us all the fodder we need to sue them again. But that's not a productive cycle of just repeated lawsuits to get a court to tell you that they're doing the wrong thing, and then the agency just continues to do it, and we continue suing them, and the wolves suffer through that process.
Yeah, the recovery program continues to limp along, both metaphorically and literally, when you think about the role of trapping. Other thoughts about how we change the political context? I mean, litigation is always going to be the backstop, as it needs to be.
Well, I don't know that an issue that, from a very broad perspective, especially when you consider the world we're living in right now today, I don't know that an issue like wolves is going to drive political change, but elected officials need to be made aware of what's going on. And that means at the county level, if you're in wolf country, at the state level here in New Mexico and in Arizona, and then, especially your congressional delegates. We're seeing a political shift in Arizona and New Mexico. And these new elected officials need to be educated both about the issue, but also about how passionate their constituents are about wolf recovery, yes, but more importantly, environmentalism and coexistence and science-based ecological function and protection. And we have an opportunity, here in New Mexico, we are going to have 3 very, very relatively fresh congressional delegates next year. We have a senator retiring here in New Mexico, and likewise, we're seeing significant shifts in Arizona. And those delegates to Washington, D.C. should be putting the hammer down on U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and other federal agencies to do right. Yes, we have the backstop of the courts, but those are the people who can pick up the phone and call the departments and tell them what they want to see, because that's what their constituents want to see. And that seems like a big reach, but political activism is more accessible now than it ever has been in many ways. And so I think, vote, as Dave said, but then build a relationship with your elected officials.
So there are really 2 calls to action as I see it. One is participate in the process. In this case, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's scoping process, which ends again in 5 days. There's a link provided in the chat box. And the other is to relentlessly engage all of our elected officials to let them know that wolves matter and that elections matter as well. I just want to, in our final few minutes here, there's a couple more questions from the chat box. Any one of you 3 panelists can take this one. I see we've answered the one about experimental populations. We've also talked about that about a fair bit. But a question from Jeff Hirsch: can you address the development of wildlife crossings and corridors to promote wolves and their prey, whatever political inhibitions there are for this? Anyone want to take that question?
Well, I'll give it a shot. Those are good things to be thinking about. They're not things that are inhibiting the wolf recovery at this point, because they're not even allowed to disperse. But once they are, we need to be protecting those corridors. And those have been defined by science. You can find published papers that show how wolves would move from the Gila region up through the Grand Canyon region, and how they might make their way up into the southern San Juans in Colorado. And once we've opened the doors and opened the gates, so to speak, across I-40, well, we do need to be thinking about those things. And there are a lot of people doing that. And I know your organization has put a lot of effort and thought into the issue of corridors. And we have some good legislation now in New Mexico to follow through on that, and other states as well.
Great, thank you, Dave. Just one more question really about kind of process and outcome before I offer some closing thoughts. So what are the next steps? When should we expect a draft plan? And just real briefly, what's the best possible outcome? So process, outcome, each of you in 20 or 30 seconds.
Well, I'll just start with the process. So this is the scoping phase of the public comment period right now that closed on June 15th. We should expect a draft rule and a draft supplemental environmental impact statement to come out for public comment later this fall. And the agency is under a court-ordered deadline that they need to have a final rule published by May of 2021. So we will have one more public comment opportunity in the fall on the draft rule, hopefully later this fall or early in the next year. And I would say, just real quickly, the best outcome for this rulemaking is if we're successful in getting the service to follow the science and the law. That's all we need to ask them to do. Like Dave said, the court handed it to them on a golden platter of this is what you need to do and go do it. And so we need to just really voice our opinion and make sure that we hold them accountable to following the science and the law.
Dave.
Kelly pretty much covered it all. The best outcome is that, wolves get to be wolves. They get to do what they do in ecosystems. They get to live where they want to live. They get to establish the densities that they know is right for their habitat. They need to be able to keep prey populations healthy by culling the weak and the sick. And, the perfect world would be, wolves are just a natural component of our ecosystems, doing what they do. They're not, not wearing radio collars and not being persecuted for being wolves.
Chris.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add. I think Kelly did cover it pretty well, but I would say that a secondary outcome to this process that we're in right now is that we show a massive groundswell of support to agency leadership and electeds that Americans and New Mexicans and Arizonans specifically really, really do value and support wolf recovery, and we're not going away. So they can, try to bypass what the judge has ordered, and yeah, we will see them in court again if we need to, but at the same time, our numbers are growing, our passion is growing, the knowledge of people invested in wolf recovery is growing, and we are going to win out eventually.
Great. Great. It's obviously a critical time for wolf recovery. I want to close very, very briefly by sharing my first wolf story in the Gila. It's a 5-day backpack. Wanted to hear or see wolves. Got to the last night. Went to sleep kind of discouraged. Was woken twice on the rim of the middle fork of the Gila. Heard not one, not two, but 3 wolves. Left the Gila feeling so encouraged. Later learned that was the middle fork pack, and both the alpha male and the alpha female of that pack, which no longer exist, each had 3 legs. One, the victim of a trap injury, the other, the victim of a gunshot wound. But those wolves raised and reared and raised pups 6 or 7 years in a row. And when I think about moments of discouragement and despair, as it relates to the challenge of wolf recovery in the Southwest, I think about the Middle Fork Pack and how incredibly resilient they were in doing what they were intended to do, which is to live in the wild and raise those pups. So as we all think about, both as it relates to wolf recovery and these times where our resilience can be challenged, I encourage you to think about wild creatures and their resilience and how that can inspire us to carry on. So I want to encourage you to comment in these final few days to make sure, as Chris Smith said, that we build that groundswell of support for wolves. And thank you, Kelly, Dave, and Chris for creating a lovely and lively conversation. We'll do it again sometime soon.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks. Bye-bye.